Erev Shabbos. How's everybody doing? Are you fasting? How are you feeling? At least in the northern hemisphere, it's the shortest fast of the year. But because it falls on a Friday, we'll have to fast a little longer since we won't get to eat until our Friday night dinner after Kiddush. If you're in the southern hemisphere, wow, this one's a rough one. Long fast, but still a minor fast. You could eat last night. So the 10th of Teves, this is a day that we remember in history. There's actually three things that we remember on this day. This is the 10th of Teves. But there were also events that happened on the 9th of Teves and the 8th of Teves that are sort of wrapped into one fast that we observe today. On the 8th of Teves, interesting, is when there was this event that the Greek Egyptian king, Ptolemy, forced a bunch of Jewish sages to translate the Torah into Greek. And a miracle was performed in that all the sages' translations were exactly the same. Now, there's no transgression in translating the Torah so that people can appreciate it in their own language. So why is that date in history seen as a calamity? I actually need to understand that better myself. But I need to learn a little bit more about this. But there's this sense that something that was very privileged and was very sacred was forced into a secular space and secular meanings ascribed to it meaning the Torah, in a manner that was not authorized by our people, by our sages, by the scholars of the Torah. The translation was done by us, but it was done with the wrong intent, and it was only because of that miracle that was performed that the Torah didn't sort of break up in its translation and get used in all kinds of ways for which it was not intended. But it was the beginning of a process that has seen the world become, both secular in many ways and antipathic, as in opposition to the values of Torah. But I really need to learn more about that, the 8th of Teves, and what happened there. On the 9th of Teves was the death of Ezra the scribe, and I believe that was 1,000 years exactly after the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. And then today, proper, the 10th of Teves, this is when the armies of Nebuchadnezzar surrounded Jerusalem in the first temple period. The prophets had been warning the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, that the spiritual level had fallen so low that the people had lost the protection of God in the land. As God told us, if we did not as a people adhere to the values of Torah and to the commandments of Torah, then we would lose the right to live in the Holy Land, and that is indeed what happened. Nebuchadnezzar's army came and eventually breached the walls and destroyed the first temple and created the Babylonian exile. Most of the people were taken away from the land of Israel and exiled. It was called Babylonia because the Babylonian exile, because Nebuchadnezzar was the king or the emperor of that Babylonian empire. But he would fall very quickly, and it became the Persian Empire, even though that was Bava, right? The Babylonian community ended up within the Persian Empire. And this is a pattern that repeated many times, right? So when the Jews, because of our behavior, lose a certain degree of protection from heaven above, we become vulnerable to the Jew haters in the world, and they arise in every generation. And they are able to attack us. But because God promised that he would never withdraw his care and love and protection from the Jewish people, we don't perish, right? And so it's a cycle that repeats over and over again. Now on Instagram and TikTok, I've been sharing both Jewish humor and Torah. And there's lots of Jew haters in social media, and they often show up there and say, well, if your enemies rise up to destroy you in every generation, one empire after another, it must be that there's something wrong with you, right? Typical kind of Jew hater logic. Now, there is something, that we have to look to ourselves and examine our own deeds. That is true. Are we living up to our responsibilities as Jews? But the people who so enthusiastically step up to become the stick with which, God chastises us, never survive that process, right? So that doesn't pay to be a Jew hater. And whatever our shortcomings may be, with respect to our responsibilities in Torah, in terms of what the Jews do in the world, I think we punch well above our weight in making contributions. We help every nation, right, live better. We sort of, we're students of how to learn and how to teach and how to make things better. And we always contribute in every land that we come from. So, the fact that Jews often meet with success and the gratitude of the lands that they come to, and then become the target of Jew haters who are just looking for the scapegoat to explain their own shortcomings, means that this story gets repeated over and over again. But it in no way justifies the behavior of the Jew haters, and sadly, it's getting worse and worse. I saw a video this morning of this kind of provocateur video maker, Ami Horowitz, was on the campus of San Francisco State University asking passing by students, hey, would you like to contribute money? I raise money for Hamas, and we're doing the best that we can in Israel, but, these Jews are everywhere, and we got to kill them where they are. And, we want to attack them, soft targets, schools, synagogues, etc. And since the Jews are so bad, would you contribute money to that effort? And these students, college students, said, well, I can't give a lot, but I'll give you $5, I'll give you $10, I'll give you $20. Students at an American university contributing, believing that they're talking to a representative of Hamas who is raising money for the killing of Jews. It's happening around us. This is real. I mean, thank God we live in a country where we have so many friends, where people respect what the Jews contribute, where people love God and understand that the timeless values of God don't change, that they were revealed into the world through Torah and through this tradition. And these mobs that are arising with their eyes puffing out in their passionate Jew hatred, I pray they will be stopped, and that these young people will be educated to understand that they've been sold a bill of goods by a indoctrination in the American educational system that is literally funded by the enemies of the Jews in order to make paint Jews as oppressors. And they've really kind of hijacked the American desire for social justice and righting past wrongs they've colonized that system to turn people into anti-Semites. And so many young people have bought that. So pray with me that people wake up to what's going on, and that this day, the 10th of Teves, which was the beginning of the destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple, can mark the beginning of a healing, of a building up, of a coming together, of people becoming, getting past that wicked indoctrination that paints Jews and other groups as oppressors when they are not oppressing anyone. And we say Amen. Sorry for the speech, but I am much perturbed with what's going on in our beautiful country that I'm so thankful to live in. Okay, it is Friday, and our daf today is page 50, here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 5. Today we open Mishna number 4, here in chapter 5. One who digs part of a pit on private property and opens its entrance in the public domain, or digs a pit in the public domain and opens its entrance on private property, or digs a pit on private property and opens its entrance on another person's private property. In all these cases, he is liable for the damage that his pit causes, right? So this chapter is going to be primarily, let's light the darkness. Thank you, Nina. And thanks for the reminder, folks. So this chapter is primarily about damages associated with a pit. So the sort of archetypal hazard that I might create either in the public domain or in a place that becomes the public domain. The archetypal case is a hole that I dig in the ground that's of a sufficient depth and people fall into it and get hurt. Obviously, I should be liable for that. But any kind of a hazard that I create where people are going to be endangered and possibly injured or even killed by it is a liability that is going to fall to me, and the relevant laws are associated with the kind of archetypal pit with a capital P, let's say. The law of the pit is the law of a hazard that creates liability for the person who created it. So here in this Mishnah number 4, and now forward, we're going to be talking much more about pits than oxen. So this pit, obviously, if I dig a pit in the public domain and somebody falls into it, I dug that pit, I'm going to be liable for that. But if I dig a pit on my private property and somebody enters my property and falls into the pit, I might not be liable. But if I dig the pit on my own property and the pit extends into the public domain, okay, well, now I've created a pit that is in the public domain. Even though most of the pit is not in the public domain, but a person can fall into it from the public domain. Likewise, if I dig a pit in my property, it extends into someone else's property, or even if I dig my pit in the public domain, it extends into someone else's property. The different variations will have slightly different results. Okay, here's the Gemara on Mishnah number 4. The sages taught in a Baraisa, one who digs a pit on private property and opens its entrance in the public domain, or who digs a pit in the public domain and opens its entrance on private property, is liable. And this is the case of a pit that is stated in the Torah. This is the statement of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Kiva says, with regard to one who renounced ownership of his property, but did not renounce ownership of his pit located in the property, this is the case of a pit that is stated in the Torah. So we're going to keep coming back to this debate between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And the basic difference, when we talk about a pit that was dug on my property, and then I renounce my property, right? My property becomes the public domain. Why does that matter? Because when I dug the pit, it was my property. So I had permission for the initial digging, and then the property, I renounced my ownership to it, so it became the public domain. So there was nothing wrong with when I dug it, but now I have left a pit in what has become the public property, right? If I just dug the pit in the public domain, I didn't have permission to do that. So of course I'm going to be liable for that. But even where I have permission to dig the pit, because when I dug it, it was my property, and then my property, I renounced ownership of it, so it became the public domain. Now that pit becomes a hazard in the public domain, and I'm going to have liability for that. And that's what Rabbi Kiva says is really the case that's written in the Torah. You had permission to dig it, but you left it there, and you're liable because of it, right? Whereas Rabbi Yishmael says, one who digs his pit in private property and its entrance opens into the public domain. So we're still linking to the public domain, but not by renouncing ownership of the property, rather by extending the pit into the public domain. And both of them claim that this is really the archetypal case that the Torah is talking about. Let's see how this debate carries forward. In explanation of this dispute, Rabbah says, with regard to a pit that a person digs or opens into the public domain, everyone agrees that he is liable for damage that occurs as a result. And what is the reason? The verse states, Exodus 21:33, and if a man shall open a pit. And it also states, if a man shall dig a pit. Two different verbs, open a pit, dig a pit, which raises the question, if one is liable for opening a pit by removing the cover of a pit that has already been dug, then is it not all the more so obvious that he should be liable for digging a new pit? What then does the latter phrase add? Rather, the interpretation of the verse must be that the responsibility for the pit comes to him by engaging in opening the pit and by engaging in digging the pit. Although he does not own the area itself, he is liable for creating a public hazard. So they disagree, now we're on page 50a, only in a case where one dug the pit on his own property and then renounced ownership of the surrounding area, like Rabbi Akiva said. So consequently, the entire area, except for the pit, is now open to the public passage. In this case, Rabbi Akiva maintains that one who digs a pit on his own property is also liable. Not only when the pit is located in the public domain, as it is written, the owner of the pit shall pay. And clearly the merciful one is referring to a pit that has an owner. Therefore, the owner of the pit pays even if it is located on private property. Let's say even if it was dug on private property. And Rabbi Yishmael maintains that the owner of the pit means that the one responsible for the hazard is liable even if he dug the pit in the public domain and then renounced ownership of it. But one who digs a pit on his own property is not liable, according to Rabbi Yishmael. So the Gemara asks, unless it, extends into the public domain, now it opens in the public domain, even though it was dug in the private domain, he kept digging until he reached the public domain. Now, the Gemara asks, rather, according to Rabbah's explanation, what is meant by the clause, this is the case of pit that is stated in the Torah, in reference to digging a pit on one's property, that Rabbi Akiva states? According to him, one is liable for damage in all cases, including digging in the public domain. So the Gemara answers, it means that this is the pit with which the verse initially introduces the subject of compensation for damage caused. In that context, the Torah states, Exodus 21:34, the owner of the pit shall pay, indicating that even a pit that is owned on one's private property renders one liable. Am I liable if I dig a pit on my property and somebody walks onto my property without my permission and falls into my pit? We're not even up to that question yet. Am I liable if he enters my property with my permission and falls into my pit? Almost for sure. But that's not even what we're talking about yet. Right now, we're just saying, I dig a pit, somebody falls in, I'm liable. Does it matter which property it's on, private or public? According to Rabbi Akiva, no. Right? If you dig the pit, you're liable. And Rav Yosef said that one can explain the dispute between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva differently. With regard to one who dug a pit on his private property, and then he renounced ownership of the property aside from the pit, everyone agrees that he is liable. And what is the reason? Since the merciful one states, the owner of the pit. It indicates that we are dealing with a pit that has an owner. When they disagree, it is in a case where the pit was dug in the public domain. Rabbi Yishmael maintains that one is also liable for a pit dug in the public domain, as it is written, and if a man shall open a pit, and if a man shall dig a pit. Which raises the question, if he is liable for opening a pit by removing the cover of a pit that has already been dug, then it is not all the more so obvious that he should be liable for digging a new pit. Rather, the verse means that the responsibility for the pit comes to him by engaging in opening the pit and by engaging in digging the pit. Although he does not own the area itself, he is liable for creating a public hazard. Now that makes perfect sense. Somebody digs a hole out in the middle of the road. It's not his road. He had no right to dig a hole there. He did dig a hole there. Somebody gets hurt. Of course the guy who dug the hole is liable. And somebody who dug a hole and covered it properly, and then someone else comes along and takes off the cover and leaves the cover off and someone falls in, well, the one who uncovered it, even though he didn't dig it, is definitely liable, according to what we just read. What about the one who dug it? He left it covered properly. He wasn't aware that somebody came along and uncovered it. Is the one who dug the hole originally going to share in that liability? Stay tuned. We're not doing that question yet. And Rabbi Akiva, by contrast, holds that one is liable only in the case of a pit located on private property where he renounced ownership of the property aside from the pit, and one cannot derive otherwise from any extraneous phrases. And this is because these phrases are necessary. For if the merciful one wrote only, if a man shall open a pit, I would say that it is specifically when one opens the covering of a pit that has already been dug, and that is sufficient for him to place a covering on it to absolve himself from responsibility for damage it causes. And this is the case where the Torah states, and not cover it. But if one actually digs a pit, it would not be sufficient to place a covering on it, and one would not be exempt from damages unless he completely fills it in. And conversely, if the merciful one had written only, if a man shall dig, I would say that it is specifically in a case of digging that a covering is required to exempt one from liability because he performed an action of creating the pit. But for merely opening it where one has not performed an action, say that he does not require a covering to absolve him of liability. You might have thought these things. Therefore, the Torah teaches us that he is liable for damage caused by a pit in both cases. And one should interpret the verse that states the owner of the pit in its plain sense, i.e., that he is the owner of the pit because it is located on his private property. So accordingly, one would not be liable for a pit dug in the public domain. That can't be. So the Gemara asks, but rather, according to Rav Yosef's explanation, what is meant by the clause, this is the case of pit that is stated in the Torah in reference to digging a pit in the public domain that Rabbi Yishmael states? Isn't one liable for any pit, including one dug on his own property? And the Gemara answers, it means that this is the pit with which the verse initially introduces the subject of damage caused by pit generally as a concept, as is explained by Rabbi Yishmael above. So only afterward does it state that the owner of the pit shall pay, referring to a pit dug on one's own property. Now the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa. One who digs a pit whose hollow space is in the public domain and then opens its entrance into private property is exempt. And this is the law even though he does not have permission to do so. And the reason he does not have permission to do so is that one may not create a hollow space under the public domain. And one who digs pits, ditches, and caves on private property and then opens their entrances into the public domain is liable. In addition, one who digs pits on private property that is adjacent to the public domain, but not actually located in the public domain itself, such as these people who dig foundations for their houses or walls, this person is exempt. But Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, deems one liable even for damage caused by pits to lay foundations, unless he builds a partition that is 10 handbreadths high in front of the pits, or unless he distances them by 4 handbreadths from the area where pedestrians walk and from the area where animals walk. Have you never walked past a construction site and seen those fences between you and the construction site? Same idea. Now the Gemara infers the reason for the exemption is that one digs for the purpose of foundations, which is the usual and accepted practice. But if he did not dig for the purpose of foundations, he is liable. Although he did so on his own property, he is nevertheless liable if people are prone to walk there. So the Gemara clarifies, in accordance with whose opinion is this baraisa? Granted, according to Rabbah, the first clause, where one is seemingly exempt from opening a pit into private property, even if he subsequently renounced ownership of the area, this can be established in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. And the last clause can be established in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who maintains that one is liable for a pit dug on his own property if it is open to public traffic. But according to Rav Yosef's explanation, granted, with regard to the last clause, all agree that this is the law. But with regard to the first clause, which exempts one who digs a pit on his own property, in accordance with whose opinion is this? It appears to be neither the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael nor the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. And since Rav Yosef explained that both of them maintain that one is liable for a pit on his own property, even if he subsequently renounces ownership of the area. So the Gemara answers that Rav Yosef could have said to you, everyone agrees with the entire passage, and as for the first clause, which exempts one who digs a pit under the public domain and opens it onto his own property, it is referring to a case where one did not renounce ownership of either his property or his pit. And this is certainly not included in the category of pit as a concept with regard to damages, and the owner is therefore exempt. This almost sounds like a tunnel dug under public property with an opening hidden in private property. Rav Ashi said, now that you have interpreted Rav Yosef's explanation of the Baraisa as being in accordance with all opinions, then also according to Rabbah, you are not required to establish it as a dispute between the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnaic period. Rather, one can say that since the first clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who exempts one who renounces ownership of his property, but not the pit, the last clause can also be explained in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. And it was previously inferred that the reason for the exemption when digging on one's private property that is adjacent to the public domain is that one digs only to lay foundations, which is an accepted practice. But if it is not to lay foundations, then one would be liable. For instance, in a case where one widened the pit unnecessarily and extended it into the public domain, he has effectively dug a pit in the public domain itself. That sounds like a pit dug in the private domain that extends into the public domain. Now the Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. One who digs a pit on private property and opens it into the public domain is liable. But if he dug it on private property, that was adjacent to the public domain. But if he dug it on private property that was adjacent to the public domain, he is exempt. Granted, according to Rabbah, this Mishna is entirely in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who does not hold one liable for digging on his own property. But according to Rav Yosef, granted, the first clause works out well in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who holds one liable even for digging in a public domain, but whose opinion is the latter clause. It appears to be neither that of Rabbi Yishmael nor that of Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara answers that Rav Yosef could have said to you, the latter clause of this baraisa is referring to one who digs to lay foundations, and therefore all agree with the ruling. It's a complicated discussion. Let's just quickly review where the law ended up before we continue. What is the actual law? If one digs a pit in the public domain, or if he digs a pit on his own property and it opens into the public domain or onto another's property, he is liable for any damage that results from it. One is liable for damage caused by pit, whether he dug the pit himself or he uncovered a pit that had already been dug. One is liable for damage caused by a pit, whether he dug the pit in the public domain or on his own property, when he opens it into the public domain or onto another person's property. And similarly, one who digs a pit on his own property and subsequently renounces ownership of the property, but not of the pit itself, is liable for damages. If he renounces ownership of both the property and the pit, or just of the pit that is on his property, he is exempt, even if the public has permission to walk there. Why? Because this pit currently has no owner and was initially dug with permission. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, which is the law, which the law follows when his opinion disagrees with that of his colleagues, and in accordance with Rabbah's explanation of his opinion. So that's why he keeps making the distinction. If he dug it on his property, so he had permission to do that. If he renounces ownership of his property, and now it's the public domain, right? But it remains his pit, then he remains liable. But if he renounces ownership both of the pit and the property, then now that it became public property, but he dug it when he had permission to do so, and he no longer owns the pit, then he does not become liable. He is exempt from liability for damages that pit causes. And that is not a bad ruling if you think about it, because if somebody dug a pit on his property, which he was permitted to do, and then later, he says, I'd like to, this town has been good to me. I want to make a gift to the town. I'm going to give my field, which is adjacent to the town square. I give it to the town so you guys can make a park out of it, right? Now, I haven't looked at that field in a while. I forgot there was a pit on my field, but when I gave it to the town, I didn't retain ownership of any part of it. It now became the town's field. So the fact that there was a pit in it when I gave it away, that should accrue to my liability when I was trying to give a gift to the town? No, right? The town, when it receives the gift, should, check the property and make sure there aren't hazards there. But it makes sense that I do not retain neither ownership nor liability for a pit that was in my field when I gave the whole field to the public. Let's get back where we were. So the sages taught if someone dug or opened a well and transferred it to the public, a well now we're talking about, and he gave it to the public for their use, so he is exempt from damage caused by the well. If he dug or opened a well and did not transfer it to the public, well, then he is liable because it's his well. If someone was hurt by his well, he should be liable. And this was the practice of Nechonia, the digger of pits, ditches, and caves, who would dig, open, and transfer them to the public so that there would be wells of water for public use. Right? So this is what do you call it? Not a philanthropist, but an altruist. I mean, somebody. This guy's doing good deeds, right? Particularly, you can imagine people would walk to Jerusalem for the 3 festivals when the temple was standing, and it was a long walk, right? And there weren't roadside gas stations. So somebody that went along that road, the public thoroughfare, and dug a well for the sake of the public who would go by there, the last thing you want to do is render him liable for people that fall in the well, right? Because then he's not going to dig these wells as a matter of public service. Now, when the sages heard about the matter, they said, this individual has fulfilled this law. And the Gemara asks, only this law and no more? Isn't it well known that Nechonia was a great man? Rather, say he fulfilled even this law and did not forget to transfer the wells to the public. So having mentioned the deeds of Nechonia, the Gemara relates that the sages taught an incident occurred involving the daughter of Nechonia the ditch digger, where she fell into a large cistern and no one could extricate her from it. So they came and informed Rabba Chanina ben Dosa so that he would pray on her behalf. And when the first hour had passed from the time of her fall, he said to them, she is at peace and unharmed. And after the second hour, he said to them, she is at peace. And after the third hour, he said to them, she has ascended from the well. He didn't know. He wasn't there. Somehow it was given to him to know. And that is exactly what had happened. In the first hour, she was safe and at peace. In the second hour, she was at peace. And in the third hour, she ascended from the well. So they said to her, who brought you up out of the well? And she said to them, a ram, a male sheep, happened to come to me, and a certain old man, and this is understood to be Abraham, was leading it, and he pulled me out. Sometimes Abraham, our father Abraham, appears to people in times of great need and saves them. There are many stories like that. And they said to Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, are you a prophet? How did you know that she had ascended from the cistern? And Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said to them, I am no prophet, neither am I the son of a prophet. He's quoting Amos 7:14 when he said that. But he continues, but this is what I said to myself. Shall the offspring of Nechuniah stumble by means of the very matter which distressed that righteous man? And Rabbi Acha says, although Nechuniah ensured that others would have water, even so, his own son died of thirst, fulfilling that which is stated, and around him it storms mightily. Psalm 50, verse 3. And now this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, is scrupulous with those around him, i.e. the righteous, even to the extent of a hair's breadth, hasa'ara, so that even minor transgressions elicit severe punishment. And Rabbi Nechuniah says the same idea may be learned from here in the following verse, a God dreaded in the great council of the holy ones and feared by all those that surround him, Psalm 89, indicating that God is most careful and exacting with those that surround him, i.e. the righteous. So we're not going to go too deep into this subject in this Gemara, but we've seen it before, and it's this kind of two contradictory ideas that we hold in tension. On the one hand, the righteous earn so much merit through their righteous deeds in this world that God loves them, of course, and is going to be indulgent and very forgiving of them. So you would think that, okay, somebody who accrues so many merits through his righteous deeds, through his scholarship, his prayer, his literal acts of good work on behalf of other people, that if he then stumbles and sins and creates some kind of a problem, he's earned some leeway with the Holy One above, blessed be He. But often we see, that, very righteous people just do one little thing wrong and it causes them tremendous suffering. So why would that be? So one explanation is the righteous do indeed earn so much merit that when they stumble and do one little thing wrong and then suffer a big price in this world, they're done suffering, right? God has actually done them the favor of meting out to them all their punishment during their own lifetime, so that when they get to the world of souls, they go to a very, very lofty place. As we've talked about many times, there's an infinite number of places where you could end up in the next world. They go to an extremely lofty place and take their place in the heavenly study hall, as it were, learning Torah with the greatest tzaddikim in history and with God's self. Because they've already taken care of the accounting, right? Whatever their misdeeds are, and we all have misdeeds, even the most righteous people have some kind of misdeeds, and we're all held accountable for all of our transgressions. Now, they're weighed against our merits, but we're not going to have so many merits as these righteous saints. So when we get to the next world, we might have to spend some time in Gehenna. We might not achieve such a lofty place, etc. But the righteous will suffer in this world, even for apparently small things, and it's a blessing to them, right? It's a blessing to them. And their merit is very high and very beloved by God, but he will be tough on them, right? He will be tough on the people that seek to be nearest to God. Rabbi Hanina says, anyone who states that the Holy One, blessed be He, is forgiving, vateran, of transgressions, his life will be relinquished, yivatru. As it is stated, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, Deuteronomy 32:4. In other words, God does not waive heavenly justice for certain people, like, that they're, because they have so many merits, they're not going to be held accountable for whatever their misdeeds are. And Rabbi Chana says, and some say that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says, what is the meaning of that which is written in the verse that recounts the 13 attributes of mercy? That God is erech apayim, long-suffering, using the plural form, and it is not written erech af in the singular. This is in order to teach that God is long-suffering for both the righteous and for the wicked, and does not punish them immediately for their transgressions. It may happen much later, either in this life or in the world to come. So we can hold both ideas together. We're on page 50b. The sages taught a person should not throw stones from his property into the public domain. Amen. An incident occurred involving a certain individual who was throwing stones from his property into the public domain. And a certain pious man found him. And the pious man said to the one who was throwing stones, "Lowlife, Reka, for what reason are you throwing stones from property that is not yours into your property?" Now, he was throwing stones from his property into the public domain. But the pious man said to him, "Why are you throwing stones from property that is not yours into your property?" Seemingly the opposite of what he was doing. So the guy who was throwing stones mocked the pious man, since he seemed to be crazy, since he was standing on his own property when he was throwing the stones. Some days later, this same fellow who was throwing the stones was forced to sell his field from which he had thrown the stones. And he was walking in the same public domain into which he had thrown the stones, and he stumbled on those same stones. And he said to himself, "Wow, that pious man spoke correctly to me when he said, 'For what reason are you throwing stones from property that is not yours into your own property? Since that property no longer belongs to me, and only the public domain is mine to use.'" And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 5. Here's Mishnah number 5. In the case of one who digs a pit in the public domain, and an ox or a donkey fell into it, he is liable. And the law is the same for one who digs either a pit, a ditch, which is narrow and long, or a cave, which is rectangular and roofed. Sounds like a tunnel. Trenches and water channels. In all these cases, he is liable. If so, why is the verse stated as referring to a pit, as it states, "And if a man shall open a pit," Exodus 21:33, to teach that just as a pit that has sufficient depth to cause death when falling into it is at least 10 handbreadths deep, so too any other excavations that have sufficient depth to cause death may be no less than 10 handbreadths. In other words, if the pit and 10 handbreadths is about 40 inches. So if it is less than 40 inches deep, there's going to be liability for injury, but not for death, because we don't expect somebody to fall into such a shallow pit to be killed from it. But if it's more than 40 inches, and remember, 40 inches, it's not that big, right? 40 inches, just over 3 feet. That's deep enough that somebody could fall into that, hit his head on the ground and die. So there's going to be lethal liability for death if it's of that depth, 10 handbreadths. If any of the types of excavations were less than 10 handbreadths deep, and an ox or a donkey fell into one of them and died, the digger of the excavation is exempt for the death. He's still, there could be liability for damages. But if it was injured in it and not killed, he is liable to pay damages. So that's the Mishnah. Here comes the Gemara. Rav says damage by pit for which the Torah obligates one to pay is referring specifically to damage caused by the pit's lethal fumes, i.e., if you suffocate in the pit, but not to damage caused by the impact of hitting the ground, for which the digger of the pit is exempt from paying compensation. And the Gemara continues to explain, apparently it can be inferred that Rav maintains that with regard to the impact of hitting the bottom of the pit, it is merely the ground that injures him. The digger of the pit does not own the ground, so it is not a case where his property caused damage. Therefore, he does not bear responsibility for the damage. So that's what Rav says. Shmuel disagrees, and the law follows Shmuel, as it generally does in matters of monetary damages. And Shmuel says the Torah renders one liable for damage caused both by the lethal fumes and all the more so by the damage resulting from impact when an animal or a person falls into this pit that someone dug. And Shmuel adds, and if you say that the Torah spoke only about liability for its impact and not for lethal fumes if you suffocated in it while you were down there, one could respond that the Torah testifies about a pit without specifying for which type of pit one is liable, and this includes even a pit full of woolen sponges, which would completely absorb the impact. But if while you were down in there you suffocated, the one who dug the pit is liable. And the Gemara asks, what is the difference between the opinions of Rav and Shmuel, given that falling into any pit involves injury due to both the lethal fumes and the impact? And the Gemara answers the practical difference between them is in the case where one fashioned a mound with a height of 10 handbreadths in the public domain without digging, and an animal fell from this raised platform and died. Remember, pit is a concept for a hazard that you created. So even though you didn't dig a hole, when you created a mound and somebody fell off that is also a hazard. So if you fashioned a mound and the mound was 10 handbreadths high in the public domain, you didn't dig, and an animal fell from this raised platform and died. So according to Rav, the one who fashioned the mound is not liable for damage by pit in the case of a mound, since there are no fumes, as the animal fell to the level ground. By contrast, according to Shmuel, he is also liable for damage by pit in the case of a mound, since there is nevertheless an impact when it hit the ground from falling off the mound. And the Gemara asks, what is the source for this reasoning? What is the source for the reasoning of Rav that one is not liable in that case? And the Gemara answers, since the verse states, and an ox or a donkey fell therein, Exodus 21:33, indicating that there is no liability for damage by pit unless the animal falls in the normal manner of falling, but not where it first climbed onto an elevated surface and then fell from there to the level ground. And according to Shmuel, the term "and an ox or a donkey fall" indicates any manner of falling, regardless of whether the animal fell into a hole or fell to the ground from an elevated surface. The Gemara challenges Rav's opinion. We learned in the Mishna, if so, why is the verse stated referring to a pit? As it states, and if a man shall open a pit, to teach that just as a pit that has sufficient depth to cause death when falling into it is at least 10 handbreadths deep, so too any other excavations that have sufficient depth to cause death may be no less than 10 handbreadths. Now, granted that according to Shmuel, the term "so too any other," this serves to include the case where the animal fell from a height of 10 handbreadths, in which case the one who fashioned the mound would also be liable. But according to Rav, who exempts him in that case, what does the term "so too any other," what does it add? And the Gemara answers, according to Rav, it serves to include trenches and water channels. And the Gemara asks, but trenches and water channels are explicitly taught in the Mishnah. Why does the Mishnah then allude to them again? And the Gemara answers, it first teaches the law about them and then explains its source in the Torah. Having mentioned these details, the Gemara asks, and why do I need all these cases that are taught by the Mishnah? The Gemara answers, they are necessary. For had it taught only the case of a pit, I would say that it is specifically a pit of 10 handbreadths that contains lethal fumes, because it is constricted and round. Therefore, this measurement suffices to cause death. But concerning a ditch, which is long, say that in a case where it is 10 handbreadths deep, there are no lethal fumes and there is no liability. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches both the case of a pit and a ditch. And furthermore, had the Mishnah taught the case of a ditch in addition to the pit, I would say that it is specifically a ditch of 10 handbreadths that contains necessary lethal fumes because it is narrow. But concerning a cave, which is rectangular and not narrow, say that in a case where it is 10 handbreadths deep, there are no lethal fumes and there is no liability. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches the case of a cave as well. And furthermore, had the Mishnah taught the case of a cave in addition to the previous two, I would say that it is specifically a cave of 10 handbreadths that contains lethal fumes because it is covered. But concerning trenches which are not covered, say that a depth of 10 handbreadths, there are no lethal fumes and there is no liability. Therefore, the Mishnah also teaches the case of trenches. Each term adds an additional meaning to the law that we couldn't have derived from the other ones. I am so close to done. If you have questions or comments, please get them in now. Questions or comments on page 50. Finally, had the Mishnah taught the case of trenches in addition to the previous three, I would say that it is specifically trenches of 10 handbreadths that contain lethal fumes, since they are no wider at the top than at the bottom. But with regard to channels, which are wider at the top than at the bottom, say that at a depth of 10 handbreadths there are no lethal fumes and there is no liability. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us the case of channels as well. And each subsequent case that was listed contains a novel aspect that was necessary for us to understand the law. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's take a few questions. Sharon, what if a person neither digs nor uncovers the pit in the public domain, but he sees someone walking towards it and does not forewarn them? Does he have any element of responsibility for the other's injuries? So under American law, definitely not, right? He did no action. He didn't do anything. He didn't dig the pit. He didn't uncover the pit. He didn't, push a person into the pit. He just kept his mouth shut and allowed the accident, the death to happen, or possibly even a death to happen. So under American law, he bears no responsibility. What does the Torah say? Do not stand idly by the blood of your brother. So to what extent is he liable? Probably this is going to be liability in the heavenly court, not in the earthly court. Certainly it requires greater analysis that I don't know offhand. But is there some kind of liability for when it was in your power to save someone's life and you just, sat back and let it happen? Yeah, there is some. Rebecca, will you forgive yourself? I think is a better question. I guess as a comment on Sharon's question. Very good. Thank you, Rebecca. And Bill says, a tunnel, one presumes, must have at least 2 exits, whereas a cave only needs 1. Very good. I think that it's exactly right in terms, that's why they didn't use the word tunnel here. But, if we're talking about a rectangular cave, right, that's roofed and has an opening on at least one end, obviously I was making a little bit of an allusion to all these tunnels, these miles and miles and hundreds of miles of tunnels that were dug using the contributions and donations of the world that was told, over the decades, oh, Israel's horrible, it's attacking these poor defenseless people, when Israel was always retaliating to a terrorist attack, and the money poured in so that these poor defenseless people could, have their homes restored. Except that this was all a scam perpetrated by the leadership in order to get all those contributions and do what with them? 10% actually goes to the people that it's intended for. 45% of the remaining 90%, half goes for terror, right? To create further terrorist attacks that will result in more contributions. And the last half goes directly into the pockets of these terrorist leadership. That's why it is not a joke. It is a very real thing. Free Palestine from Hamas, right? And these tunnels, amazing that we're reading about tunnels that can be deadly. Totally, whatever. It's a very attenuated connection to the tunnels that we're talking about here in terms of liability. But this idea that one who digs tunnels and it ends up creating harm for many people, the one who dug the tunnel is the one we need to get, right? That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night after Shabbos so that we can continue with page 51 here in Tractate Bava Kamma. May we hear only good news. May your fast be a meaningful one if you're fasting. And may we enter into the peace of Shabbos, and it may be a beautiful, uplifting, and secure peace for all of us. Amen. Good Shabbos.